Buenos Aires, December 2001. Outside a bank on a downtown avenue, a line of people who've been queuing since before dawn are shouting at security guards through a locked glass door. Their money is inside that bank, converted into an account they can no longer touch. Thanks to a government freeze on withdrawals that Argentines have already nicknamed El Corralito, the Little Corral, because it herds their savings into a pen they can't get out of. Within days, the country will burn through 5 different presidents in 2 weeks. Within months, Argentina will default on nearly $100 billion of debt, at the time the largest sovereign default in modern history. And less than a century earlier, this exact country had been one of the 10 richest nations on the planet. Wealthy enough that people across Europe used to describe a lucky man by saying he was as rich as an Argentine. This is the story of how that happened, and involves considerably more chapters of the same mistake than most people expect. If you've ever wondered how a country can go from a phrase meaning fabulously wealthy to a punchline about currency collapse within a single century, subscribe now, because Argentina is about to demonstrate that losing this much wealth as many times actually takes real, sustained effort. The country that had everything. In the years leading up to 1913, Argentina was, by several measures, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, with a per capita income comparable to France and Germany, and higher than Italy or Spain. This wealth was built on an extraordinary natural advantage. The Pampa is a vast, flat, fertile plain perfectly suited to raising cattle and growing wheat at enormous scale, combined with new refrigerated shipping technology that finally allowed Argentine beef to be exported fresh all the way to European dinner tables. Argentina became one of the world's great bread baskets and one of its great butcher shops simultaneously. And the money poured in. Buenos Aires, flush with agricultural export revenue, built itself into what contemporaries call the Paris of South America, complete with grand boulevards, an opera house rivaling Europe's finest, and an enormous wave of immigration, millions of Italians, Spaniards, and other Europeans arriving in search of the same opportunity that was, at the very same moment, drawing people to the United States. By some estimates, Argentina in this period was wealthier per person than Canada or Australia, 2 countries it is rarely compared today for reasons that will shortly become obvious. The phrase rich as an Argentine was not hyperbole. It was, for a few remarkable decades, simply an accurate description. The trouble was that this wealth rested almost entirely on exporting a small handful of agricultural commodities, beef, wheat, wool, to a small handful of trading partners, above all Britain. This is a wonderful arrangement for exactly as long as global demand for beef and wheat stays high and international trade stays open. It is a considerably worse arrangement the moment either of those conditions changes, and in 1929, both of them changed at once. The Great Depression crushed global demand for Argentine exports. Prices for beef and wheat collapsed, and the foreign capital that had financed Argentina's railways and infrastructure dried up overnight. In 1930, Argentina experienced its first military coup of the 20th century, overthrowing an elected government amid the economic chaos, and inaugurating a pattern of political instability that would recur, with almost metronomic regularity, for the next 50 years. Juan Perón rose to power in the mid-1940s, promising to protect Argentine workers and reduce the country's dependence on foreign markets and foreign capital, a genuinely popular platform after decades of watching the country's fortunes rise and fall based on decisions made in London and New York. His government pursued a strategy called import substitution industrialization, essentially trying to build domestic factories to manufacture goods Argentina had previously imported, protected behind high tariff walls that shielded local industry from foreign competition. Combined with major expansions in labor rights, wages, and social spending, this approach delivered real, tangible improvements for Argentine workers in the short term, along with an economy that increasingly consisted of protected industries that had little incentive to become efficient, competitive, or export-oriented, since they never had to compete with anyone. Perón was overthrown by the military in 1955, but the economic pattern he'd established, generous government spending funded by printing money and borrowing, protected domestic industry insulated from global competition, and a currency that periodically needed emergency intervention, did not leave with him. It became something closer to a national habit, revived and modified by successive governments of very different political stripes over the following decades, in a pattern economists studying Argentina eventually gave a name. The stop-go cycle, boom, overspend, crisis, austerity, repeat, with the country never quite managing to stay on the go side of the cycle long enough to build lasting stability. Between 1930 and 1983, Argentina experienced 6 separate military coups, a rate of political instability that made long-term economic planning close to impossible, since any given administration's policies had a reasonable chance of being reversed entirely by the next government, elected or otherwise, within a few years. The most brutal of these periods, the military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, combined a horrifying campaign of political repression with economic mismanagement, so severe that the country's foreign debt roughly quintupled over the regime's tenure, even as ordinary Argentines suffered under both political terror and economic decline simultaneously. The junta's economic team pursued financial liberalization and a fixed exchange rate intended to control inflation, which instead produced a debt-fueled bubble that collapsed spectacularly in the early 1980s, leaving the civilian government that eventually replaced the dictatorship holding an economic disaster on top of a human rights catastrophe. By 1989, Argentina's accumulated debts, chronic government deficits, and decades of monetary mismanagement culminated in one of the most severe hyperinflation episodes in modern history outside of a war zone. Inflation in 1989 reportedly reached an annual rate above 3,000%, meaning prices in supermarkets were sometimes literally rewritten multiple times in a single day, with shoppers reporting that staff would follow them down the aisle updating price tags before they even reached the checkout. Savings held in Argentine currency became worthless with startling speed. Riots and supermarket looting broke out in several cities, as ordinary purchasing power evaporated faster than most families could adjust their budgets. President Raúl Alfonsín, unable to control the crisis, resigned early, handing power to his elected successor months ahead of schedule, an admission that the situation had become genuinely ungovernable under the existing plan. The incoming government of Carlos Menem, along with Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, introduced a dramatic solution in 1991 called Convertibility Plan, fixing the Argentine peso at an exact 1-to-1 exchange rate with the U.S. dollar, and crucially, backing this promise with a legal requirement that the central bank hold enough dollar reserves to convert every peso in circulation on demand. The effect was immediate and, for a while, close to miraculous. Hyperinflation, which had been running 1,000% annually, dropped to single digits within a couple of years. Confidence returned. Foreign investment flowed back into the country. For most of the 1990s, Argentina was once again held up internationally as an economic success story, proof that a credible currency peg could tame even the worst inflation crisis. The problem, familiar by now to anyone who has watched enough fixed exchange rate schemes across history, is that pegging your currency to the dollar means your monetary policy is effectively controlled by decisions made in Washington rather than Buenos Aires, regardless of what Argentina's own economy actually needs at any given moment. When the U.S. dollar strengthened significantly in the late 1990s, the Argentine peso was dragged up in value right alongside it, making Argentine exports steadily less competitive on the world market at exactly the moment the country could least afford it. The economy slid into a deepening recession through 1999 and 2000. Even as the government remained legally locked into an exchange rate it could no longer actually afford to maintain. By late 2001, with the economy in freefall, unemployment soaring, and Argentines increasingly pulling their savings out of banks in fear of what was coming, the government imposed the corralito, severely restricting how much cash depositors could withdraw from their own accounts, in a desperate attempt to prevent a full-scale bank run from draining the financial system entirely. The public response was immediate fury. Riots and mass protests broke out across the country in December 2001, banging pots and pans in a form of protest that became known as the Castrolazo, and the resulting political chaos was so severe that Argentina cycled through 5 different presidents in the span of roughly 2 weeks, an almost unimaginable pace of political collapse for a country that was not, at that moment, at war. In January 2002, the government finally abandoned the 1-to-1 dollar peg entirely, and the peso, released from its decade-long anchor, collapsed in value by roughly 2/3 within months. Later that year, Argentina defaulted on approximately $100 billion of sovereign debt, at the time the largest sovereign default in recorded history, wiping out enormous quantities of savings held by ordinary Argentines and foreign bondholders alike, and locking the country out of international credit markets for years to come. Argentina's financial troubles did not end in 2002. The country reached a restructuring deal with most of its bondholders by 2005 and again in 2010, but a subset of holdout creditors, including specialized investment funds that had bought distressed Argentine debt at steep discounts, pursued the country through courts for over a decade, eventually winning a U.S. court ruling that pushed Argentina into a further technical default in 2014, an unusual case of a country defaulting essentially over a legal dispute rather than a fresh spending crisis. In 2018, facing another currency crisis, Argentina secured the largest loan in the International Monetary Fund's history at the time, worth roughly $57 billion, and by 2020, the country defaulted yet again, restructuring roughly $65 billion in debt during the same year. The entire world was also dealing with a pandemic, for good measure. By some counts, Argentina has now defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 separate times since gaining independence in the early 19th century, a genuinely remarkable statistic for a country that spent its early 20th century being casually compared to France. Even in years without a headline-grabbing default, chronic inflation has remained a defining, near-constant feature of Argentine economic life for decades, driven by a recurring pattern of governments financing spending gaps by printing money, rather than raising taxes or cutting spending, a habit that has proven remarkably durable across administrations of very different ideological stripes. By the early 2020s, annual inflation rates were once again climbing into triple digits, prompting many ordinary Argentines to adopt the same defensive habits their grandparents had developed during the 1989 crisis, converting pesos into dollars, property, or goods as quickly as possible rather than holding on to a currency that reliably lost value the longer it sat in a bank account. More recently, the government elected in late 2023 has pursued a sharply different economic approach centered on aggressive spending cuts and deregulation aimed at breaking this cycle, an approach still being debated by economists as to whether it represents a genuine structural fix or simply the latest chapter in a very long book, and one this particular story is, quite deliberately, going to leave to the news channels rather than the history channels to sort out. Economists studying Argentina's long decline generally point not to any single catastrophic decision, but to a recurring set of structural habits repeated across nearly a century, regardless of which political movement happened to be in charge at the time. Chronic government deficits financed by printing money, a tendency to protect domestic industries so thoroughly that they never had to become globally competitive, heavy reliance on commodity exports whose prices Argentina did not control, currency arrangements, whether floating, fixed, or pegged, that repeatedly proved unsustainable under the specific pressures of the moment, and a level of political instability, 6 military coups and 9 sovereign defaults, that made any single economic policy nearly impossible to sustain long enough to see whether it might have actually worked. Argentina's tragedy is not that any one government destroyed the country's wealth in a single dramatic villainous act. It is that an extraordinarily wealthy starting position gave the country enough of a cushion to absorb nearly a century of repeated, compounding policy mistakes before the rest of the world stopped comparing it to France and started, instead, treating it as the textbook case study for what not to do. Nobody today describes a lucky man as being rich as an Argentine. The phrase simply fell out of use, quietly, over the same decades that produced hyperinflation, currency collapse, and record-breaking sovereign default, a linguistic fossil left behind by an economic reality that no longer exists. Argentina remains, even now, a country of enormous natural wealth, among the largest reserves of lithium on Earth, some of the most fertile farmland anywhere, and a well-educated population, all the same underlying advantages that made it one of the richest nations alive a century ago. What it has spent the last 100 years demonstrating, expensively and repeatedly, is that natural wealth alone was never actually the hard part. Keeping it was. If losing richest country on earth status this many times over just feels like an impressive, if expensive, streak, you'll want to see which country manages to top it. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments which economic collapse you want covered next.